So let's start here. What are some icons or iconic elements of classic Disney animation? Well, of course, there's the image of Mickey Mouse. That's an identifying icon of Disney animation. And beyond that, there's a general roundness, or for lack of a better word, cuteness of most Disney characters that makes them visually appealing and engaging on the screen. Think of Dumbo or young Bambi, even the forest creatures in Snow White. And beyond this, there are other iconic attributes of early Disney animation. Its level of detail, the inclusion of poses and gestures whose emotional meaning is easy to read on screen, and the use of squash and stretch to smooth out motion. But if we were to spin back the wheel of time to inhabit the world of the 1930s and maybe 1940s, I think we would find one more iconic element of Disney animation that we tend not to consider today, but was central to the studio's identity decades ago. And it's this, the use of highly saturated, deeply toned colors on the screen. For many animation studios, this type of color, similar to what readers would find back then in the Sunday newspaper comics, was always one goal of bringing animated stories to the screen. There were many companies that experimented with color before Disney animation filled the screen with its rich, deep tones. This type of color process wasn't even something that Disney itself invented. It was a process that Disney acquired through a limited exclusive use contract, but even after the period of exclusivity ended, Disney still worked to identify itself with a certain presentation of color. The relationship between Disney and color was so strong that in 1961, when RCA, a company that held patents on color TVs, needed a full-color TV show to drive the sales of new color sets, they turned to Disney to create a weekly full-color show to be presented on its subsidiary network NBC, as they knew that the public saw Disney's use of color in unique ways. Disney's Wonderful World of Color became one of the most watched TV series of the 1960s. Or think of color this way. Artists at times select colors to give their works a certain feel or to enhance a painting. Color is not just a means of capturing a realistic vision of a subject, but rather a means of enhancing the emotional textures of the presentation. To effectively use color towards emotional meaning, Disney and other filmmakers needed a system whereby they could control the levels of blues, reds, and yellows in any moving image. Like with photo apps today, where you can easily tweak color levels and vibrancy and saturation, filmmakers in the early part of the 20th century wanted a way to not only present color images, but to control and alter color values on the finished film to give the presentation a certain visual texture or vibe. But to reach this goal, there were significant hurdles that needed to be overcome. No one had yet developed a color film, which meant that any colors on screen would need to start with a black and white negative, yet this was exactly what filmmakers and particularly animators played with in the early days of cinema. And this goal, not just a full-color image, but an image in which those colors could be precisely controlled, was one that would identify Disney animation for decades, an element of visual quality that often raised Disney animation above that of other studios. And that's the story that we're going to tell today. The unusual path that eventually brought color to Disney animation, a story that doesn't even begin with Disney, but one that would eventually transform the Disney studio, at least in the public's mind. Last week, after the story of early 3D animation, I received a number of emails asking about Technicolor. It's something that we've talked about, at least in part, about 9 years ago. So, today on the podcast, a story of early Hollywood, the story of inventors, engineers, and artists, and a line of unique experiments that eventually brought color to the screen, with Disney as a studio leading the way. So when exactly does color animation begin? Well, quite early actually. As early as 1911, color entered American animation when newspaper cartoonist Winsor McCay brought his famous comic strip characters to the screen. In a world before cells, sound, and processed color, McCay inked out 4,000 drawings onto rice paper, timing out character movement with the help of a stopwatch. These drawings were filmed in black and white, but then, with the aid of an assistant, he hand-tinted the finished film so that on screen, the comic strip characters of Little Nemo, Flip, and the Imp appeared with color, similar to the way they appeared in the newspaper. On screen, the film dyes appeared washed out and dull, hues like lemonade and cherry juice, a presentation that lacked the richness of the printed page. It was somewhat of a crude effort. But with this film, color entered the cinematic imagination of the American movie house. It would be 20 years more before a reliable full-color process defined the growing field of studio animation. Though many companies vied to convert the dreams of Hollywood from black and white to color, the company, later known as Technicolor, would emerge as the winner. In the early 1900s, they approached an unusual problem. Aside from hand-inking each frame of a finished film as Winsor McCay had, as though it were a paint-by-numbers project, how could a unified process create a full-color film experience using only black and white film stock? The answer to this problem would be worked out by the Technicolor Corporation in a series of research projects that lasted nearly 20 years. The story of Technicolor is in many ways the story of Dr. Herbert Kalmus, an academic who yearned to create inventions for commercial application. And this, ultimately, is the story of how independent inventors and engineers eventually changed the look and feel of Disney animation. Herbert Kalmus, born in 1881, grew up in South Boston. Though his natural skills leaned more toward math, he was led by his parents into the world of classical music, literature, and fine arts, and guided away from the popular entertainments of vaudeville, dime museums, and the Nickelodeon. His parents, Ada and Benjamin, or to friends Benno, supported the arts. With his family, young Herbert attended the theater and opera. For years, he was given piano lessons and even considered pursuing a career as a musician, that is, until a baseball collided with the end of his finger, breaking it. As an adult, he recalled his childhood with notes of happiness, especially when he was playing with the neighborhood kids. The real tragedies of his early years started when he was 8, when his mother died unexpectedly of appendicitis. Following her death, Herbert's father, never particularly good with people, arrived at Herbert's elementary school to collect him. Benno and Herbert walked holding hands back to the house. Without explanation, young Herbert was led into the viewing room where his mother was already laid out in a coffin. "I'm sure Papa was suffering terrible anguish," he said, but he was unable to try to help a small boy cope with such a loss. In the months that followed, his father, Benno, remarried but did not live long. When Herbert was 11, his father died of Bright's disease. The Boston paper would carry only a short notice. In South Boston, January 19th, Benno G. Kalmus, funeral from his late residence on Sunday, January 22nd at 1 o'clock. With this, Herbert was an orphan without brothers or sisters or other strong family connections in the world. As he continued to live with his stepmother, he found his skills leaning toward math and science. He also came to believe that, like his father, he did not always understand people easily, a constraint that would cause problems throughout his life. As a teenager, Herbert Kalmus wanted to apply to Harvard, Yale, or another liberal arts college, but lacked the Latin requirement, something that, had his parents lived, he surely would have obtained. Instead, he applied to Boston Tech, a university later to be known as MIT. Once there, he moved quickly through the departments of mining engineering then chemistry, without finding a major to call his own. When he confided in one of the chemistry professors that his courses were too much like cooking school, he was told that perhaps a more theoretical major like physics might better suit him. "What do students in physics do after they graduate?" Kalmus asked. He was informed that up until that time, the school had only graduated 2 students in physics, both of whom became teachers. When Kalmus asked why so few students sought out this major, the professor told him, possibly because it's very difficult and theoretical and in fact includes all the mathematics, physics, and theoretical chemistry taught at the university. "Are there any present students?" Herbert asked, "in the physics department?" There was one, he was told, a student named Dan Comstock. In the years that followed, Kalmus and Comstock became the closest of friends, 2 intellectuals interested in engineering wrapped up in the same program of study. Kalmus found himself welcome at Comstock's family house, a small dwelling on Huntington Avenue, where Dan lived with his widowed mother and brother. Herbert often joined them for dinner and afterward worked with Dan on their assignments. With Comstock as a friend, Herbert Kalmus finally found himself settled into his studies. During these same years, he found himself pulled into a romance that would wreak havoc on his life for decades to come. The object of his affection was Natalie Dumfrey, a girl 4 years his senior who he met at a dance. She worked as a store clerk, sometimes as a catalog model. Others would remember her as a woman with red gold curls and a vivacious personality. A woman who could be brash and outspoken. She had also taken classes in art, an education that had exposed her to composition and color theories. Kalmus fell in love quickly, somewhat desperately. He loved the way she threw back her head while laughing. He loved how she moved easily into social circles. He loved how others quickly fell under her spell. Since losing his father, Kalmus longed for a family of his own, a place that felt like home. With this in mind, they were married the following year, a marriage that in time he would deeply regret. Following his graduation, Kalmus briefly taught at a private high school in San Francisco. Even though he was only 24 years old, he was called professor and oversaw the campus. There he was required to discipline students when they acted out of line or bullied each other. Teaching, at least at the high school level, wasn't what he wanted. His true ambition, along with Dan Comstock's, was to pursue a graduate education in physics. After saving a little money, Kalmus moved back to Boston, where he became a Ph.D. research fellow at Boston Tech in a department that was still called physical chemistry. Once there, Kalmus and Comstock applied to be Austin Fellows to continue their education in Germany. Of their graduating class, Kalmus and Comstock were the only 2 to receive fellowships. In 1906, along with Natalie, the 2 men set out for the University of Berlin to study with Paul Drude, a research professor interested in optics who also ran the school's Physics Institute. But shortly before their arrival, Professor Drude killed himself, thereby decimating the Institute's graduate opportunities. In light of this, as they still retained their fellowship for international study, Kalmus and Comstock searched for other opportunities in the region. Kalmus would eventually enroll at the university at the Polytechnicum in Zurich, Comstock at a university in the nearby city of Basel. For the next year and a half, the 2 men would spend a great deal of their time together, biking through the countryside and developing theories as to how the laws of physics might give them a slight edge at local casinos, particularly with the roulette wheel. But Natalie wanted to return home. She was quietly contemptuous of her husband's opportunities. For a while, Kalmus encouraged his wife to take up a course of study at Zurich, possibly in art. She considered this, but instead spent her time at museums and out in the city while her husband labored on experiments. Though the couple had survived amicably in Boston and then San Francisco, Herbert and Natalie began to fight more regularly in Zurich. One family member would later speculate she may have resented the hours Herbert spent in his laboratory, or the focus of her complaints may have been the days and even weeks he spent exploring the country with Dan Comstock on their tandem bicycles, trips from which she was excluded. But the largest betrayal concerned her pregnancy. Natalie never told him that she was pregnant, the same family member recalled. He found out by chance that without consulting him, she had gone to a European doctor and had an abortion. This would be, when discovered, a deep wound for Kalmus, a man who yearned to create a family to replace the one he had lost. But like his own father, he was not gifted in understanding others with depth, the emotions that moved them through the world and how they came to understand situations around them. He was far better at understanding the physical world. For others, such betrayal would signal the end of a marriage. But Natalie simply returned to Boston without Herbert, choosing to live her life in a familiar town, while her husband completed his Ph.D. overseas. As for Herbert, he appears to have been a willing partner in this temporary separation, as his interest in his studies as well as his great friendship with Comstock was proving more reliable than the marriage into which he had put such great hope. At the end of their fellowships with Ph.D.s in hand, both Kalmus and Comstock returned to the States, where Comstock's family waited for him and where Natalie waited for Kalmus. "We spent hours on the return voyage discussing our future," Kalmus recalled. "Should we teach? Should we go into pure research? Should we strike out for ourselves and organize a laboratory for industrial research?" Kalmus wanted to create practical inventions that would change the world and prove profitable. "I longed for the excitement of doing something new," he said, "something that would bring me into active contact with the world of business and finance." But as neither he nor Comstock had much money, they agreed on a practical solution. They would teach at their old alma mater, while using the MIT library and school laboratories to hopefully take on a few consulting jobs that would eventually lead them into business. Already their roles in this budding firm were clear. Kalmus, with his desire to enter business, would function more as a manager, while Comstock would function more as a visionary. They both realized that they still needed an engineer with significant mechanical skills to translate their ideas into workable equipment. They found him in William Burton Westcott, a self-trained engineer who was able to translate designs into working prototypes. Together they formed a small company called Kalmus, Comstock, and Westcott, with their names arranged in order of importance. During these years, some of Kalmus's work by necessity was directed at pure research to satisfy his role as an instructor at a research institution. He worked with psychologist Boris Sidis on understanding how human emotions, something that often confused Kalmus, might be tied to a distinct electromotive force which may be trapped, studied, classified, and standardized into waves. In general, Sidis and Kalmus believed that through physics, people might be better able to understand and then manage their own emotional lives. They developed the emotion tester, a device that measured electronic activity in the body. They believed that the device might determine if a person was telling the truth. They also believed that it could quantify emotional experience. In one test, a lighted cigarette was pressed into a subject's flesh. From 22.00, the indicator on the device swung to 22.90, giving the exact measure of the pain experience. Kalmus and Sidis also worked on medical applications of technology, including how to harness ultraviolet light to manage chronic illness. Much interest is being manifested by the use of ultraviolet light under the direction of Dr. Herbert Kalmus, reported the Boston Globe. The patient treated was suffering from a large sore on the shoulder diagnosed by several physicians as lupus. It was unaffected by any of the forms of treatment which had previously been tried. When the diseased part of the shoulder was subjected to the prolonged action of ultraviolet light, a complete cure was brought about. But most of Kalmus's efforts were tied to his fledgling company rather than to research at the university. Initially, the ambitions of Kalmus, Comstock, and Westcott didn't focus on motion picture production. Working for clients, they explored ways to employ artificial abrasives for grinding wheels, and also ways to substitute cobalt for nickel in the production of high-grade steel. But some early projects slowly directed their engineering and invention interests towards film. They designed a photo speed camera, a device that could provide photographic proof to support police officers in issuing speeding tickets. The method used by the operator of the camera is to step out behind the automobile as it speeds by and press the button. One observer explained. This registers the first picture, and about a second later the shutter works automatically and registers another photograph on the same plate. Kalmus claimed that a motorist who had been stopped did not have to rely upon or argue about the officer's estimate of his speed. The position difference of the car in the two photographs could determine the exact speed of the vehicle. The first case using their camera went to trial in May 1909, a court case in which Kalmus and Comstock needed to convince a judge of the accuracy of their invention. The testimony of the camera's speed meter was accepted for the first time in the Roxbury District Court yesterday, one reporter noted, by Judge Williams, who, on the strength of what he was told by the experts who operated the new invention, fined the driver $20 for speeding. Though the photo speed camera was tested successfully with police in Massachusetts and later in New York City, it never caught on with law enforcement. Not long after, Kalmus and Company were hired by a potential investor to evaluate the effectiveness of a movie projector designed to reduce the flicker between frames. The potential investor was William Coolidge, a wealthy railroad lawyer in Boston. The device was the Vanoscope optical projector, which proposed to use mirrors to create a fading effect between film frames, thereby infusing the cinema screen with seamless action. If the device worked, the flickers, which was an early nickname for movies, would no longer be called the flickers. At their initial meeting, Kalmus quickly understood that Coolidge, an investor with a reputation in financial circles, might form a bridge between his research company and a range of possible financial backers. When Kalmus introduced his partner, he did his best to impress. "And may I introduce Dr. Daniel Comstock," he said. "A doctor?" Coolidge inquired. "Of physics," Kalmus confirmed. "In that case," Coolidge replied, "take a look at this." He showed the two men printed material on the Vanoscope projector, a machine that might need as much as $1 million to bring the product to market. Coolidge, who saw motion pictures as an expanding market, was excited to enter that industry. A prototype of the Vanoscope, he explained, was in New York available for their inspection. After making the 6-hour train ride to the big city, Kalmus, Comstock, and Westcott advised that Coolidge not invest in the Vanoscope system. But the opportunity to see the inner workings of a rudimentary image-blending device moved those three men another step toward the world of film. They saw the limitations of the Vanoscope system and also believed that they could produce a superior device. With a new investor, Kalmus, Comstock, and Westcott explored ways to create a projector that would produce a continuous fluid moving image, but instead of using mirrors, the Kalmus project would use prisms to create a blending pattern between frames. This project, too, never made an impact on the industry, but through the process, the Kalmus team taught themselves how to use film and light to manipulate an image on the screen. The experience also brought them more into the engineering world associated with film production, including early attempts to create color. Kalmus himself wasn't particularly drawn to the amusements of film. Oh, he wouldn't have said that film is the American art form. His stepdaughter, Cammie King Collin, later explained. He liked the old masters. He liked classical music. Kalmus's ideas of art at this time were still deeply influenced by his parents. But he saw the technical and financial possibilities in the growing motion picture industry, which clearly was popular with the masses. A few months after their initial meeting, Coolidge again asked the Kalmus team to evaluate an updated version of the Vanoscope projector. Again, Kalmus and his associates recommended against that investment. But during these discussions, Kalmus explained to Coolidge that if he was looking to capitalize on an invention that would influence motion picture production, that he might look to color rather than blended movement. Why not drop the Vanoscope, which at best can marginally improve black and white pictures, Kalmus said, instead of taking out a minor irritant? Why not put something new in? What are you suggesting? Coolidge asked. Kalmus looked at him, his expression growing serious. Color, he intoned. Coolidge appeared intrigued. With this, Kalmus now had a financial backer to explore usable applications of color, $10,000 to produce a sample of a working color film presentation, with an understanding that any return on this investment they would share 50-50. In 1915, color was not new to cinema. In animation 4 years earlier, Winsor McCay had created his hand-tinted film of Little Nemo, a technique that had been used for years in live action. Beyond this, Kinemacolor, a British-born company, had created a color image of sorts by using sequential framed pairs, with the first frame in each pair being photographed through a green filter and the second through an orange filter, essentially splitting the spectrum in half. This was a color additive system, meaning that the film passing through the camera was black and white but captured a black and white record of colored filtered light. For an audience, this type of film was projected through alternating green and orange filters as well. The full color effect was achieved by the two colored images being blended within the viewer's eye. But the screen results were poor, and included color flickering and light strobing whenever the filters spinning on a wheel moved out of sync with the frame advance system. The color filters also drained light from the projection, often creating a dim or dull image on screen. Kalmus, Comstock, and Westcott were aware of Kinemacolor, but they believed that with time and some financial support, they could make a better system. Early in 1915, Dan Comstock, the firm's physicist, theorized that a high degree of excellence could be obtained if two pictures taken at the same time from the same point of view through color screens could be projected one on top of the other through complementary color screens. The proposed Comstock process would require a unique camera, inventive processing to create a print, and unique playback equipment. This would later be called the Technicolor process number 1. In November of that same year, Herbert Kalmus, Daniel Comstock, Burt Westcott, and investors incorporated the Technicolor Corporation in Portland, Maine, with an authorization to issue up to $150,000 of stock. The first Technicolor camera, with an image-splitting prism situated directly behind the lens, divided the light beam evenly into twin paths. One path passed through a red-orange spectrum filter that filtered out red-orange tones. The other passed through a green spectrum filter that filtered out the green tones. As Kalmus later explained, the negatives are simply a black and white record of the red and green elements of light. The twin images were printed foot to foot on a single strip of film, creating a skip frame pattern, green filtered images alternating with red filtered ones. These images were later color sorted onto their own reels, with a dual record of both red and green filtered images for the entire film. The screen would not strobe between the two color patterns, as did the kinemacolor process. Rather, the image would blend toward color in the projected image and not in the viewer's eye. This process would create the first moving color image on screen without the film being spot inked by hand. Kalmus and Comstock also learned that they would need to specially prepare the film to account for lower light levels inside of a dual image camera. They started with ordinary black and white film and put it through a newly discovered chemical process, which resulted in a film many more times sensitive to light than any procurable on the market. But even with this film, they would still need strong light to capture a clearly defined image. Early film tests were made in Boston, often with Herbert's wife, Natalie, as the model. To better demonstrate the system, the Kalmus team traveled to Palm Beach, Florida, to capitalize on the bright southern sun. Already the team understood that they would need intense light to capture a detailed film record, as the prism inside the camera split the light captured by the lens in half to create two records. Light was further reduced by the filters used to create color records. In Florida, Herbert Kalmus and his team filmed the ocean, flowers, tourists, sailboats, sunsets, women in festive bathing suits, moonlight snaking across the water, almost anything that included color. When finished, they took the film back to Boston, where they processed it. From the negative, they created two prints. One reel that linked together all of the red-filtered images, and another that collected all of the green-filtered ones. To exhibit the film, Comstock created a playback system using two synced projectors with matched lenses and precise prisms to perfectly align the two images on the screen. One projector would run the red-filtered film with its light passing through a green gel. The other would do the same with the green-filtered film and a red gel, thereby creating a composite color image on the screen. Kalmus showed his test film in major cities around New England, screenings designed not only to demonstrate their product, but to find more investors to support further research and experimentation. Before a screening in New York, Kalmus told the audience, "There has been no big fundamental advance in the motion picture industry since its early days. I believe the time is here for the big advance, the production of the motion picture in natural colors." He then presented 2,000 feet of film largely taken during their Florida trip. A similar screening at the Algonquin Club in Boston was enough to convince Coolidge and other backers to continue investing in the Kalmus-Comstock color system. Specifically, they now wanted to create a sample color feature that could be exhibited in actual theaters, a film that hopefully would bring studio producers to their door. For this, the Kalmus team purchased the story from a professional writer, Anthony Kelly. The script was called The Little Skipper. It told the story of a little girl of rich parentage who wanders onto an outlaw ship, is brought up as the captain's daughter, and wins the affection of rough sailors, and in young womanhood returns to her native town, where she falls in love and is shunned by the wealthy man's family until they learn her true origins. Through contacts in the movie business, Kalmus and Company hired trained actors, Niles Welch and Grace Lamond, as well as an experienced director to oversee this production. Again, Kalmus planned to shoot in Florida, largely to make use of the intense sunlight, and settled on Jacksonville, which was quickly becoming a center for various film productions. Though the Kalmus marriage was now in trouble with frequent arguments, Natalie volunteered, or perhaps insisted, that she work to some extent on costume design, particularly in regards to colors that would have a strong presence on screen using the two-filter or two-strip color process. As for Kalmus and Comstock, they believed that the most difficult arrangements would involve preparing and processing the film on location. To manage these concerns, Kalmus purchased a railway sleeping car and converted it into a mobile film lab so that the film crew could make sure that they had obtained 2 viable color records before striking a set or moving to a new location. The rail car contained equipment to sensitize the film stock, baths for developing, washing, and fixing both negatives and prints, a complete darkroom, fireproof film safes, stations for editing and splicing, and even equipment to examine finished samples. It was the first fully mobile facility of its kind. With this, Kalmus and Comstock believed that they were on a path to having a proof-of-concept film to highlight their new technical process, something that hopefully would captivate big studios in New York. Their process, though, did not produce full color, rather a range of colors from the red and green areas along the color spectrum, leaving out blues and purples. Still, it was a way to place actual reliable colors on the screen. Kalmus, Comstock, and Westcott believed that the future of movies likely lay in their rolling process lab. Industry observers were optimistic. New colored films are on their way, one noted. The films as run through the machine are colorless, but they have been treated in a way which makes them so sensitive that when they are thrown onto the screen through a lens, they select the natural colors. Private exhibitions have been given which proved most satisfactory. For Kalmus, Comstock, and Westcott, with notices like this, their success was surely so close they felt they could touch it, like an apparition that floated before them, professional actors, an actual script, and a unique mobile lab that moved on rails from location to location. This limited color process, they must have thought, would surely be the first step that would quickly lead to full color. But little did they know, the actual path toward a reliable, full-color process was still many years away, so far away that Walt Disney, the person who would first promote their full-color process in his films, was still a teenager, living with his parents and taking Saturday morning classes at the Kansas City Art Institute, where he taught himself how to draw. But with their unique railway car outfitted as a film lab, Kalmus and his new company was finally moving, if slowly, toward color images that one day would richly appear up on the screen. I'll be back next week to continue this story of how Herbert Kalmus, along with Walt Disney, eventually brings full color to screens across the country. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.